mention it. Now we're recording. Okay, good. So as I was saying, for better or for worse, here we go. And let's find some slides here. Let's see. So we're going to take the term system dynamics modeling, and we're going to break it apart. System dynamics modeling. And we're going to start with the last first. So modeling, or why do we want to build models? So this is from the Trending Cycles version of this thing. So not that I'm sloppy with my citations normally, but when it's out there for, not through the university in-house on Canvas where only the students see it, but it's out to the world, I want to make sure I'm covering all the bases. So here are the sources I'm taking the things from in here. So there's basically in the world of system dynamics a couple of arguments that are kind of similar as to why we want to do system dynamics modeling. The first is kind of Jay's, Forrester's sort of spiel that he'd always give, and it's pretty powerful, I think. Number one, we're not trying to make a digital twin, right, of the real world. We don't try and model the system. We try to model a problem from a systems perspective, or a question, a curiosity, a conundrum, something we don't understand very well. So we want to simplify, right? We want to improve our understanding, clarify our thinking. When you talk to clients and they start, there's a lot of hand waving going on, and you hear, and whatever. And you say, well, could you be a little more precise about what you mean? And you get awkward silence. And it's like, yeah, we want to, I know in your mind, you kind of sort of think you know what you're talking about, but for all of us to understand, we've got to be very precise, particularly if we want to write equations, right? So it forces you to think logically and clarify what do you mean, right? What's important? We create a laboratory for controlled experimentation. That's really good. In my world of economics, it's very hard to, let's say, take one group of people and say, you're going to be the control group. So your taxes are going to stay the same. And over here, you're going to pay zero taxes. And I'm going to observe what happens. And, oh, yeah. And over here, you guys, I'm going to quadruple your taxes and observe what happens. Right? You can't, you can do that, but you can't really, right? So it's hard to run controlled experiments when you have systems with people in them. Time and space can be compressed, of course, so you can simulate hundreds of years, thousands of years very quickly. You can simulate the world, even though you're not, you're in Bloomington, Indiana, or in Arkansas or Massachusetts. We run simulation experiments or scenarios. What if we do this? What if we do that? There's an old idea in system dynamics: don't shoot yourself in the foot. Before you try whatever you're thinking about, your latest, greatest idea on the real system, let's run it on the model first to see what happens. I find it profitable when talking to people about system dynamics to talk about system design or system redesign. Like, why are we doing this? What is system dynamics? Very often, when you're talking to somebody who has some level of interest in system dynamics, they are a domain person. I'd say that's 90% of the time. They have a problem in this area. They know a lot about this area. And for some reason, they think maybe system dynamics can be a useful tool, but they're not a tools person. They don't much care about Runge-Kutta methods and steady state error and all that stuff, dimensionally correct equations. They assume you have cutting edge tools and you use them. They're just interested in the domain stuff. Every once in a while, you get a cubicle person who loves equations and programming and stuff like that. And then you can launch into ordinary differential equations and all that. So when talking to, a normal person, sort of a domain person, I find it useful to talk about designing or redesigning a system. Designing it if it's just in your mind. I have an idea. Both parties in the United States were polarized politically, right? But both sides pretty much agree that infrastructure is the building of and maintaining of infrastructure is a appropriate task for government. Bridges, roads, harbors, airports, and what have you. It's just how do you pay for it, right? And so one idea that's been floated many times is a United States infrastructure bank, an institution that would be designed just for that purpose, but it's just in somebody's mind. And you can imagine all different ways that institution can be constructed. It's hierarchy, its rules, and what have you. And, arguably you should use system dynamics to think through the design of that institution versus an institution that already exists, the U.S. healthcare system, U.S. tax code, whatever the case may be, that is in existence already. It's just not behaving very well, and you want to think about redesigning the system. So that usually resonates with a lot of people as opposed to the math talk stuff, which is, somewhat unusual. The other thing I'll mention in terms of a profitable way to discuss this stuff with non-techie people is it's a way or a tool, a method for getting experts and stakeholders to reach a consensus. So you find, and did I tell you that my Al Gore in the White House story? I don't want to repeat my stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. Okay. So that was like the big, like getting, people who know a lot about something to agree. If you can do that, that's seen as a very, very, very powerful solution. And so what you find a lot of times is that the experts and stakeholders agree on a lot of stuff, right? The widget goes here, then it goes here, then it goes here, then it's gone. The dollar goes here, comes in here, it's spent here, and it goes. Everybody who disagrees with that, and a lot of it you can reach agreement on, and then you can find the places where people disagree. And either it's a research area, there's a fact out there, it's either this way or that way, and you got to just uncover what it is, or it's not uncoverable in any reasonable way. And then you just run the model both ways every time you have a scenario. And guess what? Often, not always, but it often doesn't matter. It's not a leverage point in the system. So it's like, why are we arguing about this? It doesn't matter. So Suzanne, I see your virtual hand is up. So you have a comment or a question or both?
I have a question. So this is, I think, very helpful. Past exposure has always been, the only thing you want to do is to model the problem, don't model the system. Yet you're creating a nuance here that says if somebody has a new idea, you can use creating a model and creating simulation as a method of thinking through it properly and thinking whether it's really viable or whether or not you can get any buy-in from other people that potentially might have some stake in it. Is that right?
Yeah, and we had, for a more concrete example, we had a doctoral student. He's really good. He's one of our most talented PhD students we've had. We've had some pretty talented ones. This person, Tim Clancy was his name, or is his name? He's still around. For a project, modeled the cannabis system in Massachusetts when it was just beginning to be legalized. So they were sort of searching for, how to structure this. And he came up with, he did it just for a class project, but it was very interesting because the thing didn't really exist yet other than, there was a consensus among the politicians that they were going to legalize it. There'd be some state regulation. So there'd be a state regulation sector, the dispensaries, the growers, the various obvious sectors, and what the rules might be and the tax rates and what have you. So that might be the most recent example of something I could.
And now he's a gazillionaire selling cannabis, right?
You would think, but he just his area. He works a lot with the military and the government and the State Department because he does the emergence of radicalized terrorists with system dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
So he does his stuff is really, really super interesting. And he also does not just radicalized terrorists, but mass shootings, how that erupts, these eruptions can occur with system items. Okay. Oh, and no need to actually burn down the building again. We got fire protection engineering kids, and it's like, if you got a new design for a sprinkler system in mind, run it on the virtual building first. Let's not light a real building on fire. You know, you eventually do that. A lot of times they'll test on a building that is going to be, you know, knocked down anyway. But before you do that, you know, try it on the virtual system. One thing that you get people confused about, or it's a controversial area, maybe a not deeply thought about area, is judging models. Your model sucks, your model's great. Well, how do you know? In statistics, you kind of get into a high R squared or a correlation coefficient, statistically significant T statistics and stuff like that. But in system dynamics modeling, it's not as obvious. Now we have a whole laundry list of things, a whole checklist of things that we would want to see happen in a good model. And we don't even talk about valid or invalid models. It seems too binary, but rather building confidence in system dynamics models. And we'll get into that at the end of the course. But for now, the point we want to take away is, you know, we model problems from a systems perspective, not systems. So you judge the model by how well it solves the problem or addresses whatever it was supposed to address, right? So this is my example. This is literally, I had my father-in-law visiting out here a while ago, and I picked him up at the airport and drove him from Boston to Sterling. And, you know, it's not like he's never been here, but he's not here regularly. So, you hit the back roads a little bit. And so he doesn't know where the hell he is. And he's at the house, and he wanted to send out some postcards and stuff. Where's the post office? So I drew this map, right? And the map is a model, right? Now, if it says my house and the post office, if he could follow this model to get to the post office, which he did, and he succeeded, I would argue it's a good model, a good map. It's not fair to say it's a crappy map because it doesn't have all these other streets on it that are in Sterling, right? It doesn't have the topology. It doesn't have all the buildings and streetlights and whatever. No, it was made for a particular person to get purpose to get my father-in-law to the post office and back, and it succeeded in doing that. So again, that's what we want to judge a model. We don't want to say, well, you know, the real company has, you know, a mailroom and you don't have a mailroom in your model, so it's no good. So Jay would always say, look, it's really not a question of whether or not you want to build models. It's a question of which models are you going to use? Because guess what? We use models every single day. We don't have real economies, cities, states, families, clubs, universities, what have you inside of our heads. We have mental representations of those systems or mental models, right? And we use them every day to make our decisions. So we do modeling every day, and we use models every day. The question is, do we want to use our unaided mental models, or can we assist them where they're weak? So Jay would often draw this funnel. This is literally from one of his papers, but he would draw the same funnel or use the same figure in a lot of his papers. And as you can see, it's a funnel-based thing that says, first of all, look, when you talk about data, most people think numbers. And that's okay, but he said that's at the bottom there. That's the smallest amount of data that we have in relative terms, the numerical database. The written database, he said, is bigger, but the really big, rich, valuable, flexible, abundant data is the mental database, our mental models. And he would often pose these, you know, sort of thought experiments like, well, what if there was a car assembly plant in like Flint, Michigan or something, and Martians came over it and beamed everybody up one day and beamed down exact physical replicas of each person, except they didn't have the mental models of how to assemble cars. And yet there are all the written manuals and spreadsheets full of numerical data at the assembly plant. Could those cloned people build cars? And he would argue no, because the most important information about how to do it is in the heads of the workers. It's not in the manuals, and it's not in some numerical database. So it's the mental models that are the most important. Although if there's written information that's useful and numerical, we're not going to not use it. That's perfectly fine to use that stuff. But really what we're after is, what do people know about the system in which they live and work? That's the key. So although the mental models, the mental information is the most abundant, it's flexible, it's rich in detail and what have you, it does have its weaknesses. Our thinking can be fuzzy, incomplete, imprecise, often contain unstated goals and assumptions that we don't even think about. We might be debating somebody and our minds are changing, our mental models is changing during our conversation even. And, people are arguing, but they have different mental models, right? So the most important weakness, however, is that the human brain is a really, really bad dynamic simulation engine. It's very hard to think through the dynamic implications of our own mental models accurately, and then change one thing and re-mentally simulate our own mental model and then compare the two results. People just can't do that. We don't have the cognitive capability to do that. So this is a famous figure from Douglas Hofstadter. He's a physicist. And he's written several books. He loves feedback loops. Hofstadter does, as a physicist. But at any rate, this is from one of his famous books, Gödel, Escher, Bach, and Eternal Golden Braid. And as you see there from Wikipedia, which is, if it's in Wikipedia, must be true. It's not about relationships of mathematics, art, and music, but rather how cognition emerges from hidden neurological mechanisms. So if you read the book, I read it a long time ago. I have it on the shelf over here. It's kind of a weird book, but it's chock full of kind of interesting stuff. You see, I've highlighted Gödel, Escher, and Bach. And anyway, what Hofstadter is saying in this little portion of the book is that when I'm thinking about this, here's what I'm thinking. He mapped out his own mental model, and you can see it down here. It continues on. And what Forster says, you can't think through accurately over time this thing, something like that, and then change one thing and re-mentally simulate it and compare. You just can't do it. Now, Sterman kind of has a parallel argument. So Jay Forrester was the Germishausen Professor of Management at MIT, and Sterman is the Jay Forrester Professor at MIT. So there was Jay Forrester, the professor at MIT, and Sterman is the Jay Forrester Professor at MIT. We like to confuse people in academia. Like at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, we have several institutes inside the institute, like the Metals Processing Institute. People are like, that doesn't make any sense. And we're like, yes, we know. Why do they do that? We don't know. But at any rate, Sterman, this is from his book. If you're going to be in our field of system dynamics beyond this course, I would recommend getting a hold of a copy of his book, Business Dynamics. It's kind of the Bible of our field. What was kind of neat was when I was initially trained in system dynamics, I should say initially, I learned how to do it to a degree, and I went to summer school at MIT to learn it. But then I really learned it when I came out here, and I spent 2 years visiting at MIT and sitting next to John in his office and asking him questions. And sometimes I'd give him a ride home, and I'd bug him in the truck all the way home, probing him about how do you do this, how do you do that? And I'd show him something, and he'd go, what are you trying to do here? I wouldn't do it that way. That mentorship really helped me get a hold of, get a handle on how to at least begin building good models. It's one thing to sort of, read books and stuff and articles, but it's, having a senior course, a kind of an apprenticeship thing, like in carpentry or plumbing or something, I find it really helpful. But at any rate, John's courses, I had gazillion notes and everything. And then his book kind of took all his courses and just made it into a book. I was like, oh, this is great. Instead of my notes going all over the place, now it's all organized and, you know, and whatever. So it's really good. Anyway, he starts off the book by making the argument that you, the reader, should study system dynamics. Now, why does he argue this? In chapter 1, he basically makes two broad arguments. One is policy resistance, and the other is problems with, quote unquote, the double loop learning process. So this is kind of what Jay was saying, but John brings it more to the literature and psychology and what have you. So at any rate, this is his argument that the way you kind of navigate through life is via feedback loops. And the argument is, if you don't think that's true, start riding a bicycle and close your eyes. If you don't think that feedback is important, drive down the highway at 70 miles an hour, close your eyes and plug your ears and see what happens, right? So feedback, you know, maneuvering through the world requires processing feedback. So in this case, there's your environment or the real world, and you have some goals that you'd like to achieve in the real world. And your goals relative to the environment lead to you making decisions, which directly or indirectly, or I should say directly or after a delay, perhaps change the environment. But the problem is there are other people in the system, and they have their goals as well. And if their goals aren't aligned with your goal or goals, they can be pulling the system in the opposite direction and undermining what you're trying to do. So this is if you're a politician or a manager, whatever, you're pulling on the rope this way and everybody else is pulling it the other way. Now you might give it a good pull the first time and get it going this way, but eventually they'll bring it back the other way. And there's also, as you can see here, side effects that are often, you know, unintended consequences kind of thing. And you can change your mind. You can change your goals over time, perhaps subtly, right? So all this stuff is going on. And this is why John argues that policies, efforts to change a system, are often ineffective. You know, we've had a war on poverty since certainly the 60s, perhaps even further with FDR. I don't know exactly when technically it started, but we still have poverty. You know, we've had a war on drugs since the Reagan administration. We still have illegal drug abuse. And Jay liked to paraphrase B.F. Skinner, the psychologist, frequently, and he would say that Skinner would say that if the ancient Greeks were magically transported to the present day, they would understand absolutely nothing about our technology, but they would understand absolutely everything about our socioeconomic problems because they're exactly the same as they were, you know, thousands of years ago. Okay. So some examples from John's book. Here's one you may or may not know from your economic history. Some of us were alive when this was happening. But in the 1970s, we had a couple of OPEC oil embargoes, really disrupted the economy a great deal. And for the first time in the 20th century, we had inflation that was a big problem. In fact, it was stagflation. You might remember that's when Jay started building his national model and the Kondratiev cycle and all that. So what the Nixon administration did was to institute wage and price controls. Believe it or not, this was not a communist country. This wasn't, you know, Stalin or Mao or anything like that. It was against the law to raise wages and prices in the United States. That was phase one. It was quite ineffective. What people would do is say, okay, I can't raise your wages because it's against the law, so I'll give you a company car, or you can have 2 weeks longer for vacation or whatever. They would pay people in other ways. So the government finally decided, okay, this isn't working. So in phase two, it was unpatriotic to raise wages and prices, but it wasn't against the law. But the point is this, you're trying to hold the beach ball under the swimming pool water, and then you take it away. What does it do? It goes right back to where it would have been. Popped right back up. Some of you may be aware of something that was called prohibition. The rise of Al Capone and all the gangsters, right? Because of alcohol, it became illegal in the United States to sell alcohol, right? And of course, people were unhappy about it. So, you got the policymakers pulling in one direction and everybody else, speakeasies and all this stuff going the other way, right? And it just went right back up. This is from the book. When I took John's courses, he only had these data here, but then later on, another student was from Romania, brought extra data. So the problem here was it's very common in developed countries. The birth rate is low. Nations undergo a demographic transition. As they develop economically, their birth rates fall, their fertility rates fall. Think about it. If you're a developing nation, you're probably agriculturally based. You're a poor nation, so you have a large infant mortality rate. You don't have things like Social Security, and you live on a farm or in a rural area. So what do? You need farmhands to help you, right? Where do you get them? Cheap. You make them. You make babies, right? There's a large infant mortality rate, so you keep making them because you don't know if the infants or the children are going to make it, right? And then, you're hoping a few of them make it, so when you're old, they take care of you. Right? But then when you develop, right, and people come off the rural areas and they go to the cities, as well as there are, opportunities for women open up outside the home and what have you, the fertility rate falls across many, many nations significantly. And, that can pose a lot of challenges. If you look at Japan, for example, right, it's an aging population. China is having a bit of this as well right now. And you can solve it with immigration. Bring people in if you're not making them yourself, right? But certain societies don't want to do that, and so it can be quite a challenge. I remember the Wall Street Journal a couple of years back had a very long article for the Journal. It was spanned multiple pages instead of one column or something. So for a daily newspaper, it was quite a large article all about the demographic problems in Japan. And I vividly remember reading about this 70-some-year-old construction worker who was wearing like an eco-skeletal suit so he could lift heavy stuff because he couldn't do it anymore, but he was still working away. And get this one, like an 85-year-old nurse who was taking care of the elderly. But that's, so, well, go ahead, Ashley. Go ahead and make your comment or your question before we push on here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I was reading an article about this very thing because it's becoming a thing in the US now as well with lower birth rates. But it makes me think back to the global model that we looked at initially, where we needed to decrease the population based off resource constraints. So I think that interplay is really interesting, that it is bad for the economy, but so is having too many people and no resources. So it'll be interesting maybe to see how those interact.
Yeah, and productivity is in there as well. So with the Social Security system, when FDR put it in the US, there were 16 workers for every one retiree. Now it's 3 to 1, and it's projected to go to 2 to 1. But the workers today are much more productive. They make more stuff than the workers in the 1930s and 40s did. So yeah, you can have more people. Either you make them yourself or you bring them in. Or your existing people have to be more productive, because the key is to make enough stuff. Because when it boils down to is goods and services. Now then you get into the resource exhaustion and pollution thing as well. So there's a lot of interacting stuff here. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I mean, but can't we just say, okay, we just got to tough it out for the next 20 years until all these old people die off, and then we're going to do well. We're going to establish a new global population equilibrium at a much, much lower global population than we have in the past. We just got to gut it out for a few decades.
Or did you ever see the movie Soylent Green?
No. And I can tell a very different story on the Romanian birth rate graph here too.
You know who Charlton Heston was?
Yes, of course.
Very famous actor. I'm not sure if Ashley does, and
Probably
maybe
not.
I might know, but at any rate, the end of the movie, it's a limits to growth kind of thing. The world is overpopulated, so they feed the population with this food called Soylent Green, the name of the movie. And Charlton Heston is a cop, and one thing leads to another. He starts investigating just what the heck is Soylent Green, and he finds out at the end of the movie what it is. And they take the old people and they go on a conveyor belt and they make them into Soylent Green. It's another solution. At any rate, all right. So the Romanian government said, if this continues, we're not going to have any more Romanians. We're going to have a lot of old Romanians, then farther out, no Romanians. So what to do about it? So what family planning, all sorts of family planning techniques were legal, state-sponsored, whatever. So they said, well, let's knock that off. And boom, in the short run, they got exactly what they wanted. Their birth rate skyrocketed. But then what happened? Ding, 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 ding. And then the additional data here, was even lower than they started. So this is you'll see when we get to characteristics of complex systems, better before worse or worse before better is usually what you see with policy interventions. So this is better before worse, right? So what does John say was the results? Well, you have all the various family planning techniques here. And, basically the individual's desired family size was different than the government's desired family size. So the goals weren't in alignment. Now, the story goes that Hungary also at the same time had the same problem, but they solved it. Their birth rate went up and stayed up, and their solution was to build larger apartments, bigger playgrounds, larger schools. And the argument was, it's not that Romanians don't like children, but they didn't have anywhere to put them. And if you give them more apartment space, bedrooms, playgrounds, schools, and what have you, then they have larger families. So you align the goals. There are other such examples. So see in these figures here, John has drawn the water line. So this is it's like the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is above the water line, and there's all this other stuff below the water line you don't see. Sometimes it's called latent structure and system dynamics. So here you have, you want to get people to, if they're not going to stop smoking, smoke low tar and nicotine cigarettes, right? Okay. So the smoking-induced morbidity and mortality goes up. There's more pressure to reduce harm from smoking. So the tobacco scientists get in their labs and they make low tar and nicotine cigarettes. So tar and nicotine ingestion goes down and the smoking morbidity and mortality goes down. So you have an itch and you scratch it. That's what the government was mandating, pressuring, whatever. But below the water surface, what do you have? Okay, well, you have nicotine cravings, right, that come from the tar and nicotine ingestion, right? And then you get addicted. The body wants it or craves it as well. Okay. So what happens if each cigarette gives you less tar and nicotine? You smoke more cigarettes every day. You take more drags and you hold the smoke in your lungs longer to satisfy your cravings. What else do we have here? You get the idea here. We don't have to go through every single one of these, but now, instead of smoking problems, there's more accidents on the road. So there's pressure now, instead of for low tar and nicotine, there's pressure for safety devices in your cars. When I was a youngin', seatbelts were a luxury option in cars. Cars were not typically. If you wanted seatbelts, that was an upgrade. That was like a sunroof or something. Only the rich guys had seatbelts, right? And now you have airbags and braking systems that don't just clamp on, and all sorts of things to crumple zones and all that stuff. So there's more accidents, more pressure to do something about it, more safety systems come on board, and the itch is scratched, there's less severe, not fewer accidents, less severe accidents. But people say, hey, there's less accidents. It's okay to drive fast, no problem. Moreover, if I crash, so what? I got seat belts, I got airbags, I got crumple zones, I got what have you, right? So there's less pressure to drive slowly and safely. So you drive faster, you start weaving in and out of lanes, and what have you. So I don't have to buckle up. I got the airbag will cushion my head or something, right? So on and so forth. So there's a bunch of these things, but you get the idea. All right. The other reason that John says in his book is a reason to use system dynamics is, again, we grope our way through the world, which via a feedback process or processes. Okay. So learning is a feedback process. Adaptive behavior is learning in some sense. And again, instead of saying the environment, now he's saying the real world. I don't know why didn't use the same terminology throughout the two examples, but I don't know, whatever. And again, the real world generates information that feeds back to us, and we make our decisions based on that information, and we alter the real world. But there's more to it, of course. We have our mental models. So here he's kind of tying himself to Forrester, right, of the real world. So here's the real world, and here's our perceptions of it, right? And from our mental models, we develop our strategies and our decision rules and what have you. And so we use our strategies and such along with information to make our decisions, which influence the real world. But wait a minute, it's even more complicated because excuse me, information from the real world alters or can alter our mental models. And our mental models determine what information we decide to measure and pay attention to. So it's the double loop learning process. So let's see, 1, 2, 3. Shouldn't it be the triple loop learning process? I think it's called the double loop learning process in the literature. So I think John's not an idiot. I'm sure he can count 3 loops, but I always say it should be the triple loop learning process here. And he points out in the book that, well, look, the real world is over here. It has an unknown structure, meaning it's not entirely unknown, but it's not completely knowable. It's dynamically complicated. There's delays between cause and effect, which makes it difficult to tie cause to effect. And again, I mentioned before, you can't conduct controlled experiments. So again, a lot of this is like what Jay was talking about. Our information can be selectively perceived. You know, if you're an MSNBC person, you go there for your information. If you're a Fox News person, you go there and you don't hear the other side, right? There can be feedback that's missing. There's just no information link from something happening to you. Again, there can be delays in the information. It can be biased, distorted, ambiguous, erroneous. Mental models, we can misperceive feedback. If you see the words sit down, what does that mean? It can be sit down, or it can mean sit down. It just, without context, it's hard to tell, right? Unscientific reasoning. You see this with these simulators all the time. You give somebody 7 different switches they can move. They sit down. Before they run one thing, they flip all 7 switches on and run it. And like, oh, look at that. You say, why did that happen? I don't know, but it's neat. Run the base run, and then change one thing and compare it. You'd say that's obvious. It's not obvious to a lot of people. They don't, sort of run things scientifically or they don't think through what they're doing. And you can have, cognitive biases and defensive routines and what have you. You get doing things for political reasons, whatever. As I mentioned before, we're not good at mentally thinking through our own mental models. So that's the repeat from Jay. And then over here with the decision rules, implementation failure, I can say as an economist, cut taxes. The model says cut taxes. Now go to the Congress and say, go ahead and do it. You got to wait for those people to do it or not. And they may or may not do it. And if they do it, it might not look like what you advise them to do, right? Performance is the goal, not learning. Okay, you can be inconsistent, in the real world and so forth. So there's all these problems with the double or triple loop learning process. John points out a couple of places. I just include these because I think they're neat. The Knieza triangles on the left and a similar optical illusion on the right. Everybody sees the white triangle and the white square, right? I'll pause and make sure that's a true statement. I'm assuming everybody sees them, right? Okay, what's the problem? They're not there. I can certainly, I mean, there's like little Pac-Man things here. Everybody knows what Pac-Man is, right? But I can see the white lines of the triangle here and the parts of the square, but they're not there. So our brain is putting them there because it expects to see them there. So you see what you expect to see, even if it's not there. Now tap the brakes for a minute and say, there's a lot of implications of that, right? Your brain lets you see what isn't there because you expect to see it, even if you're not consciously expecting to see it. Now, evolutionary psychologists will say it's probably coming from the caveman days when, you're going through the jungle or wherever the heck you're cavemanning or cavewomaning. And, you see the eye and one saber tooth and a tail. And if you wait to see if it's the whole saber-toothed tiger and be double sure that it's on top of you. So your brain processes, I see an eye, a tooth, and a tail, and I'm out of there. It's a fight or flight. That's why they speculate the brain is doing this sort of thing, but it can throw you off. Your mental model can be incorrect. And then this is also in the book. This is a good one. This is from a seminar they held at MIT, and they were talking to managers about delays in the system. And these were manufacturing people. And they said, well, there's a manufacturing delay of around 75 days, order fulfillment delay, 22 days, and customer acceptance lead time, 85 days. I got a couple of contractors who keep calling me going, are you buying my insulation? Well, yeah, Mike, come on, let me know, please. I got your proposal. I'm just noodling through what's going on here, so it takes time. But what's the obvious problem here? The 22 days long bar is way greater than the 85 and the 75 days. Well, guess which of the three areas the managers who drew this, they hand drew it. They reproduced it nice in the book, but they hand drew this. They obviously worked in order fulfillment. So to that, they didn't even realize they did it, but it was their thing. So they emphasized that. So again, you can be biased and not even realize it. So guess what? If you use system dynamics, John argues, you can correct a lot of these problems. So you have the virtual world as opposed to the real world. It has a known structure. You can know, like in John's stratagem game, you can know everything about the little model economy, everything, right? You can vary the level of complexity. You can turn stuff on and off, right? Start simple, make it complicated later. You can run controlled experiments, change one thing and see what happens, right? You can get complete, accurate, and immediate feedback in the virtual world. You can force people to have disciplined scientific reasoning. You can tell the game until the player has tried everything once, don't let them try more than one thing. You can force them, right? The machine can obviously trace through the dynamics of the system. Learning can be the goal instead of worrying about performance. There's perfect implementation. If you want to cut taxes by 4%, it does it. You don't have to wait for the Congress to mess it up or whatever. There's consistency and what have you. Okay, so you should use system dynamics. That's what John and Jay are trying to tell us. Okay. All right. Now, you probably knew that anyway, which is why you're here, but whatever. That's how the official story kind of starts. All right, what do we got here? Characteristics of complex systems. So I said we're going to break apart system dynamics modeling. We did the modeling term. Now we're going to do system or complex systems. So what do we mean by that? it is remarkable. I'm on a weekly live stream podcast thing that's produced by a couple of guys in Canada. They're in Vancouver, so they start at 9 a.m. from that for them, which means it's noon for me. And the star of the show is not me. I'm one of the supporting casts. Is a guy by the name of Steve Keen. He's a very famous economist, well-known economist. He's essentially a system dynamicist, although he does his own thing. He has his own software and what have you. He's basically a system dynamics person. And they always have a guest on every Saturday for an hour. And the guest basically presents and is asked questions. And then in the second, and there's people in the chat room asking questions and stuff. And then in the second hour, it's the panel discussing things. And it is remarkable how I don't have any time to prep. A lot of times I'm in the middle of cutting my lawn and I look at my watch and I'm like, oh, gee, it's noon. I got to go on the podcast. So I just shut off the mower, wipe my brow, and get in front of the camera. And here I am. So it's not like I prep. My point is that by knowing the characteristics of complex systems, when people ask questions, even some of these people are high. There's a lot of well-known SD people who come on this as well, by the way. So it's not just economists. I usually can provide an answer just by knowing the characteristics of complex systems or make a valid point or two. So think about being in the conference room someday and you're hearing chit chat around the conference table. If you're processing things by knowledge of complex systems, even if you're not doing any formal modeling or what have you, you can often come up with some insightful comments, which, catch the attention of people, and it sort of changes the character of the conversation. So let's look at some of these characteristics that are very important. Now, I think I hand drew this the other day. This is from one of my papers, where I remember I had the eureka moment, how I said, heterodox economists and system dynamicists do the same thing. Just the heterodox economists don't use math. And I've been trying to get them to work together, blah, 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 all that stuff. So this was, I think I just hand drew this. I don't think I showed you this before. But again, real quick, system dynamics models are pattern models. You're a detective or a physician a veterinarian trying to diagnose a disease, a problem, what happened here. You piece together the clues into a coherent whole. So you're using a systems approach. The pieces get linked together into a system or a coherent explanation. If there's regularities, that we call them generic structures, they're called real types. And if there's any regularities among the real types, those are principles, fundamental principles. And the most important principle, if you remember, in economics was circular and cumulative causation. More recently, some of these heterodox economists have done stock flow consistent modeling. And of course, we do stocks and flows and feedback loops and the principle of accumulation, which is identical. And then finally, the system dynamicist or the economist detective, the economist veterinarian or physician, when they're presented with the next problem, the next patient, the next crime scene, they don't go in unarmed. They have knowledge of the principles and knowledge of the generic structures to help assist them in trying to ascertain what's going on and so forth. Okay. So we're going to examine this area right now when we talk about principles of systems or characteristics of complex systems. Neja, what's up?
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that comparison of the system dynamics modeling to heterodox economic pattern modeling.
Yep.
So if you were going to use say like machine learning methods to create system dynamics models based on having it being trained on data, would that sort of be like, then would that sort of like would that be a way, like a kind of a natural way to marry these two disciplines? in their approach?
Marry system dynamics and heterodox economics, or marry data science and system dynamics, or
Yeah, I suppose data science, which I guess isn't the same as economet. So for the pattern models of the heterodox economics, is that more like econometrics?
no, just the opposite. It's inductive logic. So basically it's the case. When I was doing all this, it was the case study method, like at the Harvard Business School, right? Where the case is not that there's no numbers in a case study. There can be graphs and tables and stuff like that, but it's not a mathematical edifice. It's a narrative. It's
I've taught a lot of classes with case studies.
Okay, so right, so
it's basically like a good story.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Like
storytelling, right? Storytelling.
Yeah.
And the idea, the original idea among the heterodox economists, and for that matter, I suppose the Harvard Business School types, was that you can't take a case study and turn it into math. That's just not possible. Certainly when I was a student, that's what the argument was. Now, those folks were not thinking about simulation models. They were thinking about the traditional like calculus models and stuff like that. But turning and well, don't let me forget to tell you the Harvard Business School case study story. But turning to data science, a lot of data science techniques are not like econometrics. Econometrics is like orthodox economics, deductive logic. You start with theory and fundamental principles, and then from that you deduce testable hypotheses. Then you look at the real world, which is almost always numbers, and then you torture the numbers with statistics. And
so the econometrics have all these assumptions about how the economy works embedded within.
Well, the economic theory does, and then from the theory. So to do econometrics, I've had this fight at WPI with the mathematicians all the time, because all the stats is taught out of the math department, and they don't want anybody teaching statistics if it's not their department, because they think numbers is numbers. And I've always said to them, look, if you're going to teach econometrics, yes, there's statistics in there, but it comes from theory. So if you don't know economic theory, you can't do econometrics. You can do statistics, but not econometrics. So it starts with theory, and then from the theory, testable hypotheses are derived, and then it has to be consistent with mathematical statistical theory to derive legitimate t-stats and r-squares and all that stuff. That's not what most of data science is. That's inductive logic, like pattern modeling. You just have a ton of data that the internet has provided to everybody, right? And you're looking for patterns. You have these algorithms that are searching for heretofore unknown patterns. The classic, beer and diapers example from data science, right? They found out that people who bought a lot of diapers also bought a lot of beer. That was unknown. It was a pattern that was found in the data. You're trying to figure out who is going to drop my cell phone plan.
But also not intuitive.
Right. Who's gonna not re-up their cell phone plan when it's over, sign a new contract, identify those people and send them a coupon for 50% off on an iPhone or something. The person who's just going to let it re-up, send them a coupon. So who is that? Well, you're trying to find a pattern amongst all the customer data to reduce customer churn, and on and on it goes, all the data science stuff, right? So that's kind of the pattern modeling approach, looking for patterns in the real world first, and then building up to a theory. Now, how one might merge those two areas, system dynamics and data science together, people are noodling through that. You might try and find reference modes. That's kind of the next system dynamics modeling. The dynamics part is we're going to do that to the next slide deck, to try and find in data, find reference modes, possibly to parameterize system dynamics models. But it's an open question. Should a system dynamics model pass synthetic data to a data science algorithm, a neural net or something, support vector machine, a random forest model, whatever, and then it does something and makes a prediction and then passes it back to the
Mhm.
system dynamics model, which does something with it. Because that's what they do in the real organization, for example.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of people kind of noodling through how to do this. I think I'll give you my last thing, and then don't let me forget my Harvard Business School story. And I see your hand up, Ashley. I'll get to you. I think if you study system dynamics, there's a standard method, as you're going to see. You start with a problem statement in words, then you turn it into a picture. We call it a reference mode. Then you do a dynamic hypothesis, and dun, 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 you follow these steps. It's iterative. You circle back, always checking yourself. But in the end, you get a decent model, and it's codified, and we teach it. It's repeatable. There's a similar sort of, it's a circular thing in data science, and it's got a name. I don't remember the name, but there's a sort of a iterative method that you go through in data science as well. In a similar vein, the very first step in that circle, that wheel for data science, is understand it says the business, understand the business. I would say understand the system. Because what happens is with data science people, you train them with all these highfalutin algorithms, and they're usually programmers, computer scientists, undergrad CS majors, quantitatively oriented, and you dump them into a business that has a problem. And
the
they're
problem
finding
by
they're
nature is
helpless.
Deductive. That's deductive reasoning when you start with a problem, isn't it?
Well, they don't understand the business. They've never studied business stuff. They've studied algorithms and programming and Python and stuff. So they're finding you dump these folks into a business setting, or it could be a government setting, where there's a problem and they don't know what to do, right? And I've suggested, now everybody has a data science program these days. I said, why don't you try and make WPI's data science program distinct? Because the first data science step is understand the business. I would say understand the system. Merge it with system dynamics. So you show people how to first understand the system, and then they can figure out where are the leverage points, and where should I intervene with my data science techniques. I'll give you a story. I got a lot of stories. I was contacted by Fred Rucker. He was on the board of trustees at WPI, and I got to know him because I was a faculty rep to the board of trustees for 3 or 4 years. So I would eat lunch with him and stuff at trustees meetings. And he calls me up one day. He goes, Mike, he goes, my kid, he's in a business school at Notre Dame. And he goes, he's got a great opportunity. And since you were on the faculty in the business school at Notre Dame, I thought I'd run it by you. I'm like, okay, I haven't been there in 30 years, but okay, glad. Why not? What's your thing? He goes, well, he has an opportunity to do a project with McKinsey and United Airlines in Chicago. I'm like, oh, that's pretty good. He won a competition or something. They picked, one really good student. So, oh, that's cool. All right. And he says, my son doesn't know what to do. What should he do? And I'm like, doesn't McKinsey have an idea? Doesn't United Airlines have any? Why are you asking me? It's like, he goes, no, they don't have any idea. They're kind of leaving it to him, and he doesn't know what to do. Do I have any ideas? I'm like, oh, geez. I'm like, all right, let me think about it. So I thought about it a little bit, and I came back to Fred and I said, all right, have your kid go to this website and download the People Express flight simulator. So People Express Airlines was famous in the 80s for having spectacular exponential growth and then collapsing. So what happened was they said, we'll fly you from like Pittsburgh to New York City for like $30, but we're not going to serve you any soda or snacks on the plane. You're going to carry your own bags on. The pilot might be also taking your ticket. And it was a no frills airline. And people were like, well, this is great. $30. I get halfway across the country. So what happened is they burned out their people so badly that bags were going to the wrong airports, and the flights were delayed and canceled, whatever. And then people said, I'll pay full freight somewhere else because it's crazy. It's not worth the $30, all the hassle. And the airline went bankrupt. So it's a Harvard case study. And John Sturman turned it into a simulator, the People Express flight simulator. Don Burr, the CEO of People Express, said it's the best example of what happened at People Express that he ever saw. So I said, have your kid download the simulator and run the airline and see if he can find out if there's leverage points where you change this thing a little bit here and a big thing happens here, as opposed you change a big thing here and nothing much happens. And I said, so find out in an airline where there are proposed leverage points and then propose to United Airlines and McKinsey, that's where we want to do a data science thing and then find out, So, so actually, before I do the Harvard case study, go ahead. What's your?
So I guess just since we're talking about data science and the overlap of econometrics and data science and system dynamics, Nate had sent out a email about AI after I brought that up in the one lesson, and I read the article. Thank you for sending it.
Welcome.
So sorry I didn't respond. I just realized I didn't respond. Sorry, I'm a little behind on my emails. But yeah, I was reading that, and my thought is that AI and data science might also have an application in feeding the systems dynamics models. So the inputs could potentially be made live by AI interpreting data as inputs into a systems dynamics model in real time, or data science could be used again just to like fuel the reasoning for like how the bathtubs fill and empty.
Yeah, because model conceptualization, perhaps. Yeah, I'm sure it's wide open for research. I mean, I certainly don't have the answer. And things have changed from when people first started thinking about AI and SD, 30 years ago to the present day. You didn't have Chat GPT and the internet and all that stuff. So yeah, I'm sure there's lots of master's theses and doctoral dissertations that will eventually be written in that space. My Harvard Business School story, by the way, because again, the case study approach is a pattern model and all that, is in 19, let's see, Jay turned 70. He was born 1918. So 1988, he turned 70. And at the time, retirement was mandatory at MIT. You had to retire. So I was invited to his retirement party, and was held at the Computer Museum in Boston. And it was real interesting. I sat with a whole bunch of engineers that worked with him on the Whirlwind project and some of the Navy stuff, and they had a million Forrester stories and whatever. It was really delightful to have supper with those guys. But at any rate, Jay was retiring. At the same time, coincidentally, John Sturman, who's now the J. Forrester Professor of Management at MIT, was an untenured assistant professor going up for tenure. And it happened in the same year. And the thinking was John would not get tenure. Jay was going to retire. And that was that for system dynamics at MIT. Thank you very much, but it's gone. So they went over to the Harvard Business School and they said, well, what we're doing is essentially computerizing case studies like the People Express Airlines. We took the Harvard case study and made it into a model. And with the exercise, you read the Harvard case study first, then you run the simulator. So, I mean, so they were trying to move the system dynamics group to the Harvard Business School in anticipation of Jay retiring and John not getting tenure. Much to everybody's delight, John got tenure. So they went to Harvard and said, abort, no need. But Harvard did spend some time at one point preparing a collection of Harvard case studies with the associated system dynamics model. And they got some ways down the road. I think a lot of the people who were involved with that have passed away and whatever. So it fizzled, and probably the dean in charge of it retired or whatever. So it never really got rolling. But that was, because again, it's the case study. It's a computerized case study. That's another way of thinking about what a system dynamics model is. Okay, yeah, the AI thing, there's a lot. That whole AI thing is going to be changing. That and the blockchain and a couple of these other big innovations are really going to change the world, I think, as we go forward. Okay. So when we talk about principles of systems in system dynamics, we got to be a little careful, because some people use the phrase to discuss principles of actual complex systems, which is what I want to talk about in this deck of slides, versus principles of system dynamics modeling, right? And even some people get into principles on the relationship between structure and behavior. So when Jay wrote his book, Principles of System, it was mostly principles of system dynamics modeling, although he has a few areas of principles of the relationship between structure and behavior. Alan Graham wrote a whole dissertation on structure and its relationship to behavior. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the characteristics of actual systems. And here's a couple of sources if you want to read up on what I'm going to talk about here. Okay, so what are the principles of actual complex systems? Well, number one, they're dynamic. Okay, so they change over time, often on different time scales. Okay, so that can be tricky business when you're building a model. So if I were to ask you to build me a model of oil prices, and then pose the question, in your model of oil prices, are you going to have oil wells? New oil wells, the existing stock of oil wells, and decommissioned oil wells, or oil wells that are turned off. Like in the aluminum business, they turn aluminum plants on and off, depending on the price of aluminum, or they can literally decommission a plant. So would you have oil wells in your model of oil prices or gasoline prices, do you think? What do you think? These are these derrick things, and you see in California the wheel turning and it's
I
pumping.
think you have to have them in the model because they're the units of production.
Okay, so we got one yes, a vote for yes. It's going to be in the model. Anybody else want to weigh in? It's a yes or a no, or a maybe. Safe bet is always to go with maybe, or it depends. They say every question in economics can be answered with it depends.
It
So
depends
what's your
on the
time frame?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It depends on your time.
Yeah, if it's a short run time frame, you can assume the number of oil wells is constant, like weekly oil prices or monthly oil prices. If it's a longer time frame, yeah, the wildcatting, and then we think there's oil here, and we'll do some test wells and all that. That whole process probably has to be in a longer time framed oil price model. So it just depends. So they change over time, but on different time scales. So one of the problems with conceptualization is, what do you mean by time? Minutes, weeks, months, years, whatever. And that's going to help frame what's in your model and what's not in your model. As a consequence, we try to get people to see pressures that unfold over time, that cause events, not events that occur at a moment of time. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, right? That mindset is at a moment of time, a thing happened. And the system dynamics approach says, no good. We want to look at the pressures over time that led up to Pearl Harbor, right? Switching the framework or the mindset. The next important idea in system dynamics, structure causes behavior. The dynamic behavior of a system is a consequence of its structure, of its design. The airplane flies the way it does because it's designed to fly that way. Now, it could be consciously designed the way it's designed or unconsciously. Nobody in their right mind would design the U.S. tax system from scratch as it is today, or the U.S. healthcare system. It's evolved that way for a myriad of reasons over time. But whether it was consciously or the design as a consequence of evolutionary pressures, its design is causing its behavior. So therefore, to change the behavior, you've got to alter or redesign the structure. Okay. If you take this point of view, or you are adopting an endogenous point of view, you're looking inward for the cause of system problems, not outward to the environment, shocks in the environment that are causing your problems.
So I have a quick question. I'm endogenous and the exogenous concepts are really normal for me. I'm curious if that's new concepts for Najla and Ashley, or are you familiar with those terminologies?
That's new for me.
Oh, I mean, I'm just familiar from having a philosophy in Latin
Mhm.
background.
So whenever I'm trying to talk to people, Mike, about a system, and I skip through those terminologies, which I think are very, very descriptive and mean a lot in my mind, I'm always stunned by the number of people that have no idea what that means.
Yeah, the easiest way to, well, that's right. Most people don't think that way.
Mm-mm.
The easiest way to think about it is endogenous means there's a feedback loop, cause and effect circling back on itself, and exogenous, there's one-way arrow from A to B, but not feeding back from B to A. Economists
tell
call
you-
it,
So I'll tell you how I think about it, or how I learned about it from a medical perspective. Is an endogenous behavior is something that's created within the system itself, and if it's exogenous, it's a behavior that impacts the system from outside.
Yeah.
And it seems like hair splitting, but for me, that says so much about what system dynamics is about. And the reason I bring all this up is just because I'm stunned at how many people that is not part of their vernacular.
so when we play the beer game, have I mentioned the beer game? I don't want to repeat my stories. And, Forrester's book had the industrial dynamics, had the retailer, wholesaler, distributor, and factory. It's a whole system management, and they made a game out of it. Tell you about the beer game? Can I tell you about this? Yes, no, I don't.
I mean, you mentioned it.
Okay, so real quick I think that Suzanne is absolutely correct when she says that, because so let me quick show you the beer game. If you're going to be in the field of system dynamics, you got to know what the beer game is. It was funny. The beer game was played since like 1960, 61 at MIT. To this day, it's the first thing that every MBA student does at MIT. But it was really never talked about outside of MIT. Like if you went there and you played it, you were familiar with it, or came across system dynamics somehow, but it wasn't widely known until Peter Senge wrote a book called The Fifth Discipline. Peter's a system dynamics guy. And in the book, it's a very popular management book. And he described the beer game in the book. Suddenly, every company wanted the beer game played. So the cry went out. The book came out in 91, I think. So it was the early 90s. Anybody who can facilitate the beer game, we desperately need. It's one thing to have played it, but you got to be able to facilitate. It's a little tricky. So I was facilitating it all the time. So I was on a plane once a month for like 3 years, facilitating the beer game all over the world. I did it in a castle in Scotland, Marco Island, Florida, ski resort in Utah, Lake Geneva. I did it once for Caterpillar Corporation, for all their Latin American distributors, and everything I was saying was being translated into Portuguese after I said it. I did it for 500 Columbia University MBA students down at Chelsea Piers in New York City, where they have the indoor golf driving range on the Hudson River and all that. I mean, it was amazing. I was going everywhere doing this thing. A lot of times I needed helpers, so I'd bring students. I'd say, who wants to earn a couple of $100 and go to Marco Island all free? And down we'd go. So the beer game, what's going on real quick to show you this, to illustrate what Suzanne is saying, that people don't think about endogenous versus exogenous. So the game and Jay's original model had 4 stations or players in the game. And what you did in the game was you placed your orders upstream. Your orders went upstream. So this was the retailer, this was the wholesaler, this was the distributor, and this was the factory or the brewery. Okay, so you ordered your beer from your supplier. It was a supply chain management game. And then the beer would come downstream. The distributor got it from the factory, the wholesaler from the distributor, and the retailer from the wholesaler. And what it was originally it was pennies. Then we finally went to bingo. I used to have to drag bags of pennies around the world and then you have to get it through customs. What are you doing with all these pennies? And they're heavy, sweating, dragging these things and the boards. And finally the plastic bingo chips are a lot easier. But at any rate, so the bingo chips or the pennies are moving this way, and the slips of paper where you're writing your orders are moving upstream. So if the retailer was short of beer, he or she had to get it from the wholesaler. But if they were short, they had to get it from the distributor and so forth. Then of course the factory or the brewery had to make it. They didn't order it from anybody. Now the retailer would get their orders for beer from a deck of cards. And the deck of cards is from the game facilitator. So there's a pattern of orders on the cards. So almost everybody who plays the game, unless something weird happened, almost everybody who plays the game, this is effective inventory over time. Effective inventory is inventory. So you have cases of beer in inventory here, pennies. That's your inventory. And if you're stocked out, if you have backlogged orders, your inventory is negative. So what would happen is everybody does this. They'd go negative. They'd overreact. Everybody did that when they played to various degrees. Some people wasn't this egregious. Other people was like crazy egregious. And as you moved up, the bullwhip effect was in play. As you moved up the supply line, it got bigger just naturally because the delay was getting longer and longer, right? So everybody who plays it does this. So one of the takeaways is structure creates behavior. Structure causes behavior because it's the structure of the game makes it virtually impossible to not oscillate, right? Now you can oscillate a lot or a little based on your decisions. You can be really aggressive and overreact, but you can't play the game with no oscillations. It's not possible. Right? Anyway, so why am I telling you this and how does it relate to what Suzanne was saying? Well, that most people don't think that's about endogenous behavior and whatever. We try and get that point across when you play the beer game. So when the game is over, people are given a bio break, a cell phone break. They go do whatever they got to do. And we put up we have them graph their results. And everybody does the same thing. And so when they come back from their bio break, they see like, hey, that's what I did. And look at everybody did the same thing. And then you also put up plays of the game that other people did from previous plays, and they're doing the same thing as well. So the takeaway there is structure causes behavior. Like everybody who plays it does the same thing. Okay. But then you ask them, draw me the pattern of orders on this deck of cards. Now the retailer knows, so the retailer can't answer. So what does almost everybody do? They say, oh, the pattern of orders had to be this on that deck of cards. Why? Because that's what they experienced in the game, right? And then you ask one of the retailers, go graph on the board what the pattern of orders was, and it was this. It started at 4 in equilibrium. You shocked it, it went to 8. And then for the rest of the time, it was 8, 8, 8, 8. And people are ordering 200, 110, and stuff like that, right? They can't believe it. But you point out, if you drew this, you were blaming what happened to you on the deck of cards, on exogenous factors. There was no feedback from the game to the cards changing the cards. It was a one-way shot. The arrow went from the cards into the game, but nothing was coming back. So anybody who said it was the cards that did it, that caused me to behave that way, is taking an exogenous point of view. They're blaming external factors. They weren't blaming the design of the system and their own decisions, right? This is a very powerful way of bringing that home, because some people get it. Like if you're a control engineer undergrad and now you're an MBA student and they kind of get it, you know, but the average citizen does not. They're like, blown away by that. That there's like no way it could be just 4 and then 8 for the rest of the game. Okay. So most people do not think systemically. They don't think endogenously. They don't think like a system dynamicist does.
And by the way, I just love these simulation games I've facilitated. We've talked about this before, Mike, but I facilitated the beer game a couple of times, and I've done there's another one out there called Friday Night at the ER. It's very similar sort of stock function, but based on a medical emergency. But it is really stunning. And I've facilitated that one a couple of times too, when people kind of get the aha. And I think the rub that is so powerful is, if people will do it, is that they recognize that they have responsibility about how the system functions by the choices that they make. And they may resist that and not want to hear that and go around, but there are sometimes it is just profound impact, kind of a gut punch sort of thing, like, oh my gosh, I'm doing it to myself.
That's right. That's the message.
And it can be extremely powerful when people really understand what it means for endogenous behavior. To me, taking responsibility and, oh, I'm doing it to myself equals endogenous behavior in my world. But you can't, it's something I think people have to experience, but
people, they don't naturally think that way. So that's, cool. Okay. So along these lines, if structure causes behavior and therefore to change the behavior, you have to alter the structure. The next obvious question is, well, change the behavior to what? What do you mean by better or solved and what have you? And that can also get into, what do you mean by a better city? You want more open space, or do you want more structures that are built that offer shopping or whatever? Depends on to whom you're speaking, right? So on and so forth. So sometimes it's not obvious what better or solved means, okay? And if you can define better, you also want better to be robust and resilient, that things don't just fall apart the first time there's another external shock to the system. And finally, we try to emphasize all of this is just an academic exercise unless you can give real policymakers precise things that they can actually do in the system to implement the model-based recommendations. Okay. So what do we mean by structure? Well, there's structure in the model. How do we put the Lincoln logs together in a model to make it represent the structure that's important to our problem? But what do we mean about structure in the real world? The physical structure, the material stocks and flows, the widget goes here, then it goes here. The person is young, then they're middle-aged, then they're old. The dollar goes here, then here, and then it goes to the customer, whatever. Resources, constraints and limiting factors, technological innovations. The institutional structure, organizational units, lines of authority, formal and informal laws, information availability and quality, the rules of the game. Driving in Massachusetts, there's the stuff in the manual that you take a test on, and then there's what everybody does that you just got to learn so you don't get into an accident out here. There's all sorts of Massachusetts centric very odd driving behavior that you just got to figure out, or you're going to be an offender bender. And then the psychological decision-making structure. I believe this is where the cutting edge is, or one of the cutting edges of our field is. How do you represent people's heuristics that they use to make decisions? Incentives, rewards, goals, values, prospect theory. It's shown that people attach much more value to not losing $100 than they do to gaining $100. So you've got some asymmetries and preferences going on. People behave out of habit, standard operating procedures, traditions, whatever. So getting a handle on that stuff and then accurately representing it in a model, I think, is kind of the cutting edge of our field. We kind of know how to do the financial stuff and the material stuff. It's the psychological stuff that's a little challenging. I think we've probably seen this already, so just go quickly. Then once you, in the real world, identify the important structure, you use the Lincoln logs, the Lego pieces, stocks, flows, feedback loops, and what have you to represent them in your model. Complex systems are nonlinear, so effects are rarely proportional to causes, okay? So when do we have nonlinearities that we have to worry about in a system? Well, number one, when multiple factors interact. And so how do you mathematically smear them together? In this case, what does a good city mean? So you have to sort of smear all these things together into a mathematical representation of good, right? The other time you would typically use a nonlinear relationship would be when there's limiting factors, floors and ceilings. And so as the trajectory of the system approaches a floor or a ceiling, you have to describe what happens to the trajectory. So think about pouring, well, I got a mug, this time it just has water, but you're filling it up, right? And let's say I want to get it to this line right here. That's my goal, my target. You know, as I approach the target or the goal or the limit where I want it to be, what does my hand do? It just doesn't instantaneously snap off. I'll probably, as I see the level rising, slow down and then stop, right? So there's not a mess. So you have to describe that, right? Complex systems are tightly coupled, governed by feedback, and adaptive. So everything is kind of connected to everything else, okay? Decisions alter the state of the world, causing changes and triggering others to act, thus giving rise to new situations, which then influence the next decisions, okay? So people in the system adapt, they learn, right? And this requires taking into account feedback loops and a holistic approach. How are all the pieces of the system linked together? So this is the classic picture that has been on the internet for a long time. This was done originally by PA Consulting, which used to be Pew Roberts. They've been bought out again, so I don't know what they're called now, but this was Jack Pew and Ed Roberts' company that did this. And as you can see, so this is kind of more Ashley's shopping cart here. It's a little hard to see on this scale, but we have here our different classes of people and their support for either the government. Let's see if I can make this, sorry, let me try and make this bigger. How about if I go like this? There we go. So this is the population actively supporting the government, the population sympathetic to the government, the population on the fence, the population sympathetic to the insurgents, and the population supporting the insurgency. So you can move, people can move among these groups, right? And you have the Afghan National Security Forces, their tactical and institutional stuff. You have the coalitions, resources, capacities, whatever. You have the government's capacities, the tribal structure, infrastructure, services, and the economy, the insurgencies or insurgents and the outside support of the insurgents, the narcotics trade that funds at the time a lot of what was going on in Afghanistan, and all this stuff, you know, everything is connected to everything else, right? Maybe not directly like an arrow from here to here, but eventually something, you know, a change over here worms its way and shows up over here, right? The behavior of a complex system is often counterintuitive, okay? Not what you believe or think through at first pass. The causes of problems and the symptoms of problems are not closely related in time and space. So cause and effect are difficult to identify, okay? Now, Jay would always argue, but intuition and judgment come from a lifetime of experience, which with simple systems in which cause and effect are closely related in time and space, okay? So that makes it difficult to interpret, you know, something like this. And then we also tend to confuse correlation and causation. Okay, so that's very common amongst people as well. So the intuitive solutions to problems in complex systems are almost always wrong. And the symptoms usually get the attention, not the fundamental causes. So this guy has a book and a website, Tyler Vigen. He strikes me as somebody with a lot of free time on his hands, but okay. You roll how you roll, but this guy's into finding weird correlations. And I really like this because it's not that everything's just a line up or a line down. There's all different time shapes here, but what do we got here? Suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation against U.S. spending on science, space, and technology. A number of people who drowned by falling into a pool against films Nicolas Cage has appeared in. Divorce rate in Maine versus per capita consumption of margarine. When I was a kid, it was illegal to sell margarine in my home state of Wisconsin. I think the farm lobby had something to do with that. So people would sneak it across.
Just got so offended.
Yeah, people would sneak margarine across in the trunks of their car across the state. Let's see, Age of Miss America against murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. Again, this guy has a lot of free time on his hands, but okay. Total revenue generated by arcades against computer science doctorates awarded in the US. Worldwide non-commercial space launches versus sociology doctorates. Japanese passenger cars sold in the US versus suicide by crashing a motor vehicle. Okay. Letters in winning word of Scripps National Spelling Bee against number of people killed by venomous spiders. So correlation is not causation, but people often get the two confused. The behavior of a complex system is often insensitive to significant changes in parameter values. Therefore, Jay would always scold the economists. You people spend a lot of time trying to econometrically estimate the parameters of your econometric models. And he said that's of limited value because you can change these parameter values 20% in either direction and almost nothing happens because of policy resistance, all these negative loops keeping the system where it's at. You're also going to see in a minute here, it can also be due to positive feedback loops, path dependently locking a system into a particular trajectory. So the behavior of a complex system is often resistance to policy changes, as we've suggested earlier. So a policy is a rule that describes how available information will be used to determine action. Okay, so think of policies as rules. Okay, a policy is composed of both a structure, in other words, what information sources are selected and how they're used, and the parameters, which are sort of the weights attached to what you're going to do, how much influence this or that has. And since complex systems are generally insensitive to changes in their parameter values, it follows that they are also generally insensitive to policy changes represented by parameter changes. So when we talk about redesigning the structure of the system, parameters are part of the structure of the system, but it's usually not a parameter change that gets us where we want to be. We have to typically alter the stock flow feedback loop structure. The behavior of a complex system is often controlled through leverage points. So complex systems actually have a high degree of sensitivity to changes in a few parameters. So where are they? So that's where a system dynamics model can be very useful. This is what I was getting at with this People Express airline thing to the kid who's going to work at Fred Rucker's kid with McKinsey at United Airlines. Where are the leverage points in an airline? They are often located in counterintuitive places, and the direction of sensitive parameter changes are often counterintuitive. So consider steering a sailboat or a lighter in an ice cube. Classic example. These come from Peter Senge. So Peter would say, if you think about what do you call it? A sailboat is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so let me clear this. So I'm a bad artist, of course, but that's never stopped me. So let's take a top view of a sailboat. And the thing is going in this direction. So we're looking from the top down. So here's the mast and the sail is, doing something like this. and the sailor is back here, and the sailor has his or her hand on the tiller, right? If you want to make, so this is a negative feedback loop system. The target is the direction I would like to go in. So let's say the sailor decides that he or she wants to go over here to the port side, to the left. So the front of the boat has to go to the left, this way. So to make the front go left, where do you intervene? Where's the leverage point? Not the
Yes.
bow, but in the stern, in the back. So you
Yes.
intervene in the back to change the front. Which direction does the sailor push the tiller to go to the left, to go to the port side, left or right?
The other way.
To the right. You push it right to go left. So negative feedback loop systems are counterintuitive. Same thing if you have an ice cube and a cigarette lighter, and you're trying to make the room warmer, but without changing the setting on the negative feedback loop system, the thermostat. Do you put the sensor of the thermostat? Do you put an ice cube or a lighter next to the sensor to make the room warmer? You want to kick the heat on without turning up the setting. What do you use? An ice cube or a cigarette lighter?
A cigarette lighter.
Ice cube.
So you use an ice cube, right? You make it colder at the sensor so it kicks the heat on
Yeah.
and warms it up. If you want to make it colder, you use the lighter. It's just the opposite of what you would do. So complex systems can also have a high degree of sensitivity to non-parameter structural changes. Those are, adding a feedback loop, deleting a loop. That's a very common thing that we would recommend in system dynamics. So here's did I tell you the Jerry Barney story and the Millennium Institute story and Jimmy Carter? Did I tell you that one?
No, I don't think
Okay,
so.
so Jerry Barney was a physicist, and he worked for Jimmy Carter in the Carter administration. And he was kind of the czar in charge of, at the time, Carter was concerned about Agenda 21 or President's Report for the 21st Century, something like that. I don't remember the exact name. And because Carter was, he had the oil crisis and the limits of growth came out and all that stuff. And so Jerry headed that up, and then Carter lost re-election to Reagan. So Carter's out of office and Jerry's out of a job. So what is he going to do? So he decides to continue with that line of reasoning, and he thinks that system dynamics is just the tool to do it. So he forms an organization called the Millennium Institute. And they had a spaceship called the Millennium Falcon. No, just kidding. That's not true. He forms this organization called the Millennium Institute, and they build a giant system dynamics model of a developing country. Just like urban dynamics, it wasn't the Boston model, it was a model of a city. Well, Jerry's model, it's called Threshold 21 or T21, is a model of a developing nation. And then they go around the world trying to get hired to work with developing nations to tune the model up to their specific situation and run simulations. So it's very comprehensive. It has a sociological sector, education, health, and all that, as well as the economy and the environment and whatever, all interacting. It's really a neat model. So Jerry's trying to get other people to use it. So he was going to the World Bank, for example, and saying, hey, World Bank, why don't you use my model? And they're like, we have a model. We don't need your model. So Jerry is like, well, what is your model? Can you give me some information? Well, yes, it's called RimSim X. So RimSim Extended. So RimSim X was a large scale Excel model that was worked on by hundreds of people over many years. It had like 40 tabs in Excel worth of interacting crazy spreadsheet stuff. And I've been told, I'll just tell you what I've been told. So like billions of dollars were going around the globe based, at least in part, on what RimSim was saying. And I also was told that, there'd be a negotiation for a loan from the World Bank, and they just weren't getting to yes. And so they'd say, let's take a coffee break. And they'd go out and they'd get to a staffer and say, fiddle with it. I need it to say this. And they'd come back in and say, we've rerun the model and we think we have a solution. Everybody shakes hands and the money moves. So Jerry's like, well, can I see RimSimX? They're like, no, not really. Well, somehow I don't know how he did it. He got them to give him a copy of RimSimX. And so he hired Mohammed Mohtahissada, an Iranian student who was doing his PhD in system dynamics at SUNY Albany. They hired him in the summer. They said, can you translate this crazy thing into its equivalent system dynamics representations so we can compare it to threshold 21 and go back to the bank and say, here's what your model's doing. Because Jerry said they don't even know what their own model's doing. So many different people have worked on it, and it's this crazy Excel thing. So Mohammed tried to mechanically do it. He gave up. He said, it's too crazy. I can't do it. So he wrote some software that can suck in an Excel model and spit it out in its equivalent system dynamics representation. And he was going around consulting with it, saying to companies, hey, what are you using? Let me suck it in and show you what it looks like in system dynamics. Then I'll show you a better way to do it. The World Bank was stunned when they saw what their own model, when it was done in system dynamics, because they thought this was causing this and they weren't even connected, for example, because the spreadsheet was so crazy. Nobody knew. So eventually they adopted a threshold. I don't think they threw away T20, RimSimX, but Jerry got his foot in the door. So then he goes back to his, what's the point of the story? He goes back to his old boss, Jimmy Carter, who's now ex-President Carter, has a presidential center down at Emory University. And Carter was really interested in development economics. Apparently, he was really into the guinea worm and all the diseases that come from guinea worm in the water. So guinea worm bad. That's like they said, never make jokes about guinea worms around Carter. Not good. So, okay. Carter says to Jerry, well, I will consider using your model down at the Carter Center, but I want my people to take a look at it. My chief economist and some of my staff. Jerry said, fine, come on up they were in Arlington, DC, just outside of Washington. So then Jerry's on the phone to me, Mike, I got his Carter staff coming up here and one of his head economists, and I need an economist in the room to help me here. Can you come down? I'm like, yeah, no problem. So down we go. So that's me, and that's one of Carter's staffers there. And I was going through leverage points and systems. So we had like a 3-day thing, and Carter's guy is presenting his model and we're presenting threshold 21 and the whole thing. In the end, Carter agreed to adopt the model. We had like half of the people were ex-ambassadors, ambassador so-and-so, ambassador so-and-so. But anyway, I do this thing with leverage points. I can't do it here online, but what I do, I usually pick a bigger guy from the class. I say, come on up here. I say, I'm going to hold you back with one finger. So I'm trying to hold, and I say, walk over here, and I'm going to hold you back with one finger. And the guy just walks over there. So I go, I'm going to pick another point on you. And I pick another point. I go, walk over there. I'm going to hold you back with one finger. The guy just walks over there. Last chance. I'm going to pick one more point on you. I'm going to hold you back with one finger. You put your finger right here. Nobody can move. Or if they move, they're doing one of these limbo things. You can also hold a person on the ground if they're laying down with one finger right here. It's a huge leverage point right here. You can try it with your friends and neighbors or something. Party gimmick. But it illustrates what a leverage point is in a system. Here it doesn't work. Here. There's anywhere it doesn't work. Here, suddenly they put the brakes and they can't move. So that's what we're looking for with system dynamics is leverage points. Because we want to change the behavior of the system and we got to alter the structure, but there's not a lot of places where it's effective. I mentioned this before, long run, short run trade-offs. Okay, time delays mean that the long run system responses are often different from the short run system responses. High leverage policies often cause worse before better behavior, right? Low leverage policies often generate transitory improvement before the problem gets worse, better before worse. But guess what? Voter or shareholder pressure and political expediency tend to incentivize policy changes that favor short-run considerations over long-run considerations and set the stage for long-term degeneration. So this is a famous figure in system dynamics. So Dave Kreutzer, a well-known SD guy from back in the day, saw this, and I think it was the cover of the New Yorker. And he said, that's a system dynamics thing here. So this poor dude has a problem, he's claustrophobic or whatever's happening here. So his policy solution is to knock this domino over. Of course, there's a long run, short run trade-off. There's a delay in the system. There's, I guess you'd almost say, a feedback loop here, right? And of course, in the long, better before worse, right? And the joke is that, well, this guy has done a great job. He solved the problem. He gets promoted, and his successor sits down in the chair just in time for their kersplat. This got to be so famous. It was on T-shirts and hats and coffee mugs and stuff. Dave contacted the author. Here's his name. I don't know what the heck his name. I don't remember. And he had the guy draw this little man doing other system dynamic stuff. And every once in a while, this was years ago, but every once in a while, you still see a few of these coffee mugs and T-shirts and hats and stuff floating around the System Dynamics conference. Complex systems often drift to low performance. Okay, the bias towards near-term, better before worse policy changes lead to short-run improvements followed by system decline. But the initial improvements are remembered and the original policy changes are redoubled. This causes another round of short-run improvement followed by deeper long-run difficulties. Complex systems often shift the burden to the intervener. Corrective programs imposed on a complex system from the outside exogenously can have far less than their intended effect because they tend to displace the corresponding internal processes. So think about eyeglasses. I know Nashal, you're wearing glasses. Suzanne's wearing glasses. Ashley, I don't know if you're a contact lens wearer or whatever. I have terrible eyesight. I think I told you my story where you're not flying nothing off of nothing. So I'm blind as a bat without eye correction. So, if you've been a long time glasses wearing person, you may not remember this, but when your eyesight, you can't see the board, it's a little fuzzy, you go to the eye doc gives you glasses, you wear them for a month or whatever. And then when you take them off and you in class to clean them or something, or rub your eyes, and you look at the board, what happened? Your eyesight is now uncorrected, way worse than it was before you ever got the glasses, because the glasses, the lenses take over the function of your eye muscles that are working to focus your vision. They become lazy or atrophy, right? And that's what it's saying. Doing a child's math homework for them does them no good. You're trying to help them, but their reasoning power gets fuzzy. And they can say the thing about a pocket calculator, their long division skill, gets atrophied. Probably no active externally imposed program is superior to a system modification, system redesign that changes internal incentives and leaves the burden of system improvement to internal processes, endogenous perspective. The behavior of a complex system is almost always unpredictable over any useful time frame. So Forrester would say, now this is my diagram, but he would draw similar sorts of figures. So he would say, all right, here's the path of the system right here. And at period 4, a forecast is made. And he said, I don't care, use whatever neural nets, support vector machines, tea leaves, GoDentrals, doesn't matter, whatever you use to predict the future. And he said, for a short time, your prediction will be pretty good. You can predict the weather 1 second from now. I predict it'll be like now. I was right. Good, I'm going to be a weatherman. Well, that's fine, but it doesn't do you any good if you're a farmer and you want to know what to plant this coming spring, right? That's a different story. Is it going to be a wet spring? And so forth. So it's not, the predictions aren't good over any useful time frame. It's due to the momentum of the system. And Jay would say, if the aircraft carrier or the cruise ship or the oil tanker is plowing through the ocean, and again, the sailboat example, the captain says, hard a port, and the helmsman or helmswoman cranks her over to the left, what happens? Nothing. The thing keeps going on its trajectory until eventually it starts to turn. The momentum is overcome. So out here where the decisions made back here based on the forecast have an impact, you can't forecast. If you do, it's just luck. It's not a systematic thing you can do. So Jay would always say, why are you trying to do this? Instead of trying to predict the future trajectory of a complex feedback system, it's better to spend your time redesigning it so it behaves well, no matter how it's getting shocked or beaten around. Complex systems exist in a state of disequilibrium. So equilibrium is a very weird concept in the real world. Dynamically, everything is a horizontal line. Nothing is changing. Everything's at rest. There's no pressure for change. Now, in my field of economics, everything is equilibrium, equilibrium, equilibrium. So here's a micromile, supply and demand, and it settles at an equilibrium point where the buyers and the sellers are both allegedly happy, right? And in the macroeconomic world, here's an ISLM model, the monetary market and the real market, or real sector, monetary sector, real sector, are in harmony and in equilibrium at this GDP and this rate of interest. So economists love equilibrium, but it doesn't exist in the real world. Dynamically, everything is a horizontal line. Now, having said that, we use equilibrium all the time in system dynamics because it's a great reference point, particularly when we're building a model. Put it into equilibrium, everything's a horizontal line, then knock it out with a shock, like the beer game, 4, and then it goes to 8. And whatever happens has to be how the system is processing the shock. So equilibrium is good. It's a useful concept, but no real system exists in a state of equilibrium. No living real system. The behavior of a complex system is often self-organizing. Okay. So what I have here is a system that starts in equilibrium, and then I activate some noise just from a uniform distribution. And look what happens. The system starts to oscillate. The oscillation is not due to the random numbers. I mean, they release the oscillation, but the system is designed to oscillate. It's not driving the system from the outside with an oscillation. It's just releasing it from equilibrium, and then it does what it wants to do, which is to oscillate. So again, it sort of self-organizes itself. Okay, now there was, I think I skipped this one. There was this is another reason why systems get locked into where they're at. This is path dependency. Now, remember we said policy resistance is when a system gets locked in because of negative feedback loops, right? They're holding the system where the people in the system want it to be, and the policymakers trying to pull it in a different direction, right? And then they might succeed in the short run, and the other actors pull it back. So negative feedback loops, by their definition, are stabilizing. They try to hold the system where it's at. So if it's in a bad behavior, but there's incentives, whatever they may be, the actors in the systems like what they're doing, they're going to keep it in the bad situation. So negative feedback causes systems to be stuck in a bad situation. But positive loops can do it as well, and that's called path dependency. So this is a really cool way to illustrate path-dependent processes. This is due to positive loop. It's called a Polya process. It's called a Polya process. It was a Hungarian mathematician named Polya who came up with this. And the way to think about it is as a like a jar like this, a parfait jar or a flower vase, something that's clear, but you can put stuff in it. And think about putting in white and it doesn't have to be black and white, and 2 colors, pick your color, but black and white is the classic. And you start by putting a black stone and a white stone or marble, whatever you want to say, in that clear jar or vase or whatever it is, okay? And then you follow a rule. And the rule is down here. You add a white stone or a marble, white marble, if a random number from a uniform distribution between 0 and 1, that means any number between 0 and 1 is equally likely. So the algorithm is going to spit out a random number between 0 and 1. Each value is equally likely, unlike a bell curve where, in the middle, those values are more likely. No. uniform distribution, all values are equally likely. The rule is if that number that gets spit out is less than the fraction of the marbles or stones that are white, add a white stone, otherwise add a black stone. So think about it. If you start over here, all these plots start at 50-50. This is the fraction white. So if 50% are white, 50% must be black because you put one of each. There's two stones. One is black, one is white, right? So 50-50. Think about market share for two firms, for example. Okay, then you follow this rule. Now I did it, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 simulations here. After, what did I say, 100 periods of time, the fraction, think of this as market share of the white is as high as, I don't know, 80% and as low as nothing. It's never going to be 0 because you're starting with one of each. It's never going to be 100% because there's always one, at least one of the other one, right? Here I did it like 50,000 times. And you can see pretty much any solution is possible. But look at the time shapes here. Past about period, I don't know, 20 or something, the thing gets locked in. It's not going to move, right? There's the fraction, the chance that the next random number is going to be less than the fraction white. If the fraction white is 0.9, it can happen, but it's not very likely. You get locked in. So there's a lot of implications of this. History matters, right? So, you know, at the beginning, you can go down different routes, but once you get locked in, your future is dependent on your past. That's one sort of takeaway from this. You get into situations of technological lock-in with path dependency, where inferior technology gets adopted and used, and people won't use the new technology. So QWERTY keyboards, QWERTY across the top, is not an efficient layout of the keys. A Dvorak keyboard has a much more efficient layout of the keys, right? So why would you create keyboards, number one, that have an inefficient layout? And number two, why will people continue to use them? Well, the answer is, in the old days, when I was a student, we would type our papers on a typewriter, a mechanical typewriter that had these little arms that would come up and strike a typewriter ribbon and make a letter on the paper, right? And if you were a really, really good typist, you type so fast that these little arms would get jammed in the typewriter, and then you'd have to pull them out, and you get ink all over yourself, and you clean yourself up, and then you type again. So the manufacturers of the typewriters will slow you down. They want you to type fast, not the hunt and peck thing, but not so fast that you jam the keys. So, of course, once you got an IBM Selectric with the ball that rotated, you didn't have these arms jamming, and then you went to word processing and all that. It was unnecessary. So why stick with the QWERTY? Because everybody, the installed base of people who knew how to use it, QWERTY keyboard was so big, and the manufacturers, there were so many QWERTY keyboards out there. You're going to teach a Dvorak, who the hell are you going to teach a Dvorak keyboard to in typing class or whatever? So you're just locked into the inferior technology. And it was the same thing with VHS VCRs versus Betamax in the old VCR days. You know, Sony was better, more technologically a better a picture and all that. It was limited on the length of the movie. You usually couldn't have a 2-hour movie on a Betamax. The VHS didn't have that problem. But for some reason, randomness, idiosyncratic reasons, when you'd go to the video store to rent a video, I know it seems old school before streaming and DVDs and all that, the rack, for whatever idiosyncratic reasons of choices, was better for VHS. So when you'd go to buy one for your, your den, you have one in your bedroom or your living room, you buy one for the den or the bedroom, you'd get the format for which there were more tapes. And then the makers would say, well, there's way more people renting VHS formats, so let's make more of those. And again, the install base grows, and at some point you get locked in, right? So this is very, very, very common. So, so both positive and negative loops can cause systems to be locked into bad behavior, and you have to redesign the system to pry them out of that behavior. All right. I'm looking at my clock. once again, Mike could continue going for another 55 hours and not even realize it's like as though time stands still. But I know you probably have had enough and you're going, uncle, no more, no mas. Brain is filled with system dynamics. So where we're headed next time with all of this is we're going to read. So we did what? Oh, sorry. We did system dynamics modeling. We did modeling and system. We didn't do the dynamics, but that's the start of how do I build a model? We get all the background. Now we start with a problem statement in words, and then we turn it into a picture called the reference mode. That's a dynamic time shape. So what are the time shapes? How do we identify those, right? And then what causes the time shapes? Stocks and flows. The stocks and flows do not exist in isolation. They're part of feedback loops. So we're going to do some exercises to find the loops and find the stocks and flows and start conceptualizing a problem, right? Then we'll introduce the software, and then we'll be building models. So we are going to be building models. We have until December, so we have plenty of time to cover that ground carefully, so we all know what we're doing, as opposed to there's a lot of hand waving and we skip over a bunch of stuff and and then it's like, good luck. Because it's really important, I think, to learn how to do it in a disciplined way with patience. And in the end, your models would be way better than if you're with great enthusiasm building a model as fast as you can move the mouse. That's the enthusiasm is good, but the lack of a disciplined approach to modeling is usually bad. Usually there's terrible models created that nobody understands, including the modeler. So we try to avoid that by, there's a process we go through that we've learned over the years that tends to work well to get people on the right path. So that's kind of where we're heading with the next lectures. So I would say it'll be 2 lectures or 1.5 lectures before we literally start introducing the software and getting way into the details of how you use it. Okay, but that'll be coming, before you know it, and then we'll be modeling for the rest of the term. Okay. Any questions or comments or whatever in light of that?
This is all very helpful. Some of it's a little more organized in a way I think that will stay in my brain. Is there any way that I can get a copy of the syllabus? Remember, we were going to do a PDF.
That's uploaded. It
is okay. I
Yeah,
just
it's
haven't-
PDF'd and uploaded. Yeah, with all the
Okay.
links, or they should.
Okay.
The links, I don't know if they're live. I think,
But I can type them out if they're not. That's fine.
right. That's what I'm getting. I think you
Yeah.
can click on it and it might say it's blocked or allow in PDF, and then if you allow it, it goes there. But worst case, you could copy and paste the link or even type it. Yeah. So, okay. Any other thises or that's?
Nothing from me. Thank you for
Turn your head like this to go to sleep and all the system dynamic stuff pours out onto the pillow, right? So, all right. Very good. We'll see you all next week then.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. Bye.